A single mother is forced to wear an apron and serve her family in silence after they locked her children in a basement to keep the aesthetic of their holiday. But as the wine flows, the guest of honor realizes the woman serving them isn't a servant. She's his boss, and she's about to hand them a life-changing eviction notice. I hope your week has been filled with peace and that the coffee in your hand is as warm as your heart. Before we begin, please take a moment to hit that like button and tell me in the comments, how is the weather in your city today? I love hearing from you. Now, let's go to Aspen, where a mother's coldness is about to meet a daughter's silent power. The heavy oak door of my $8 million Aspen retreat did not just open. It groaned under the weight of my mother's entitlement as she burst inside, shaking the mountain snow from her mink coat like a wet dog. I stood in the shadow of the arched kitchen doorway, my fingers tightening around a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching as Victoria and Arthur, the people who had spent 34 years making me feel like an inconvenient footnote, marched into my living room as if they owned the very air they breathed. My father was huffing, his face a blotchy red from the high altitude and the stress of a credit card that had likely just been declined at the rental office down the street, while Victoria was already stroking the hand-stitched Italian silk throw pillows I had ordered from Florence last spring. She did not know the pillows cost more than her first car. She only knew they felt like the status she was so desperate to reclaim. I felt a cold, sharp amusement settle in my chest, a silence so deep it felt like an abyss, as I watched them scramble to hide the cracks in their crumbling facade. They were bankrupt, homeless in the middle of a blizzard, and yet here they were, critiquing the decor of a mansion they had essentially broken into using an old security code they must have pried from a former associate. "Thank God for small mercies, Arthur," Victoria hissed, her voice cutting through the quiet of the house like a serrated blade as she threw her designer handbag onto my marble countertop. If Sterling saw us standing outside that locked rental office like common beggars, Cassandra's entire future would be flushed down the drain. This place is acceptable, though the lighting is a bit dim. We'll just tell him we decided on a more private estate this year. It was classic Victoria, spinning a humiliating defeat into a grand narrative of exclusive luxury. She hadn't even noticed me yet, her eyes too busy calculating the resale value of my artwork. I set my glass down with a deliberate, soft click and reached for the plain white linen apron hanging on the pantry door, a sudden, wicked clarity washing over me. If they wanted to play act at being the masters of a house they couldn't afford, I would give them the audience they deserved. I tied the strings behind my back, smoothing the fabric over my simple knit dress, transforming myself into the one thing they had always treated me as, the invisible help. "Who's there?" Arthur barked, spinning around as I stepped into the light of the kitchen, my head slightly bowed, my expression a mask of dull, robotic obedience. Victoria's eyes narrowed, her face contorting from panic to a familiar, ugly sneer the moment she recognized me. "Eleanor? What on earth are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice dripping with a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "I told you specifically that you weren't invited to Aspen this year. Your struggling mother energy is far too depressing for the image we are maintaining for Sterling." She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the apron with a mixture of confusion and immediate, cruel satisfaction. "Wait, are you actually working here? Have things become so desperate for you and those children that you've resorted to scrubbing floors for the elite?" I didn't correct her. I simply let the silence stretch, watching her chest swell with the pleasure of finding someone she could still look down upon. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, Mother," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the hurt she expected. "Well, at least you're finally being useful," she snapped, already turning back to the mirror to fix her wind-blown hair, her lack of gratitude as sharp as a winter frost. "Don't just stand there like a statue. My daughter Cassandra will be here any minute with Sterling, and I will not have him see a speck of dust or a single sign of your typical mediocrity. If you're going to be the help, then be silent and stay in the background." She reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture that was less an affection and more like checking the quality of leather. I felt the ghost of 1,000 past dismissals, the weight of a lifetime spent being told I was a liability. But today, the weight felt different. It felt like power. I watched her glide across the room, already barking orders at my father to hide their mismatched luggage in the mudroom. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so intoxicated by the smell of expensive wood smoke and the sight of high ceilings, that they didn't stop to wonder why their failed daughter had the keys to an $8 million sanctuary. The arrogance in the room was stifling, a thick layer of the American dream gone sour, where hard work was something they expected from others, while they lived on the fumes of their former glory. My mother began rearranging the crystal vases on the mantelpiece, her movements frantic and performative, as if she were trying to claim the space through sheer force of will. "Arthur, make sure you mention the foundation," she directed, her voice rising in a rehearsed lilt. "Sterling needs to know he's marrying into a family with deep roots, not just deep pockets." The irony was a bitter pill that I swallowed with a smile. Just as she reached for a bottle of my vintage Cabernet, the sharp, melodic chime of the doorbell echoed through the foyer. Victoria froze, her eyes widening as she smoothed her skirt one last time. "That's them. Remember, Arthur, not a word about the rental office. We are the guests of honor in this magnificent estate, and Eleanor is simply a fortunate coincidence." I retreated into the shadows of the dining room, my heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm as the front door swung open to reveal Cassandra and her golden ticket, Sterling. The show was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the script. As the laughter of my sister Cassandra and the rehearsed, oily charm of Sterling spilled into the foyer, I knelt on the cold white marble of my own kitchen, a damp microfiber cloth in my hand. The transition from the CEO who signs multi-million-dollar contracts to a woman scrubbing a floor she paid for was jarringly easy. Mostly because my parents had spent my entire life training me for the role of the invisible observer. I moved the cloth in slow, rhythmic circles, the scent of expensive lemon verbena floor wax filling my senses. But my mind was already slipping backward through the fog of time, to a Christmas 3 years ago that still felt like a jagged piece of glass in my heart. Back then, I wasn't the owner of an $8 million mountain retreat. I was a terrified single mother in a drafty 2-bedroom apartment, clutching a thermometer that read 104 degrees. My daughter Sophie was 4 years old, her small body shaking with a fever so high I could feel the heat radiating off her skin through her thin cotton pajamas. I remember the silence of that night, broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the window panes and the frantic thumping of my own heart as I called my mother's cell phone over and over again, praying for a voice of reason or a shred of comfort. When Victoria finally replied, It wasn't with a phone call. It was a short, sharp text message that I still see whenever I close my eyes. "Do not ruin my Christmas party with your drama, Eleanor," she had written, her words as cold as the Aspen snow outside. "Children being sick is a liability, and I won't have your struggling mother energy dragging down the atmosphere of this event." I stood in that dark kitchen 3 years ago, staring at the blue light of the screen, realizing that in my mother's world, a grandchild's life-threatening fever was merely an inconvenience to her social standing. That was the night my pain began to fossilize, turning into a hard, cold stone of determination. I looked down at my hands now, still moving the cloth over the marble, and I saw the ghosts of that struggle, the calluses from working 3 jobs, the ink stains from late nights studying the market, and the scars of a woman who had to pull herself up by her own bootstraps because the people who were supposed to catch her were too busy admiring their own reflections. Every inch of this house was a testament to that struggle, a physical manifestation of the American dream that my parents preached about but never truly practiced. They believed in the dream as a birthright, whereas I had treated it as a war. As I reached under the mahogany breakfast bar, I could hear Victoria in the next room, her voice rising in a theatrical trill as she showed Sterling a painting she didn't realize I'd bought at an auction in London. "Art is such an investment in the soul, don't you think, Sterling?" she cooed. The irony of her words tastes like ash in my mouth. She had never invested a single soul cent in me. She had only ever seen me as a poor return on her investment of time. I felt a surge of the silence of the abyss, a calm so absolute it was terrifying, as I realized that the woman in the next room was a stranger who shared my DNA, but none of my values. The memory of Sophie's fever blurred into the present as I felt a sharp, polished heel click-clack toward me across the floor. Victoria stood over me, her mink coat draped over one arm like a trophy, her face twisted in a look of profound disgust. "For heaven's sake, Eleanor, pay attention to the corners," she snapped, her voice low so the important guests in the foyer wouldn't hear her talking to the help. She reached out and nudged my shoulder with the toe of her shoe, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a slap. "Sterling is a man of high standards, and I won't have the smell of your poverty and failure lingering in this room like a bad perfume. Scrub harder, and once you're done, stay in the kitchen where you belong." I didn't look up, didn't let her see the fire in my eyes, or the CEO she had unknowingly invited into her own downfall. I simply squeezed the cloth tighter and whispered, "Yes, Mother," letting the words fall flat and hollow. In my head, I wasn't just cleaning a floor. I was preparing the stage for a reckoning they would never forget. I moved from the kitchen to the dining room, my footsteps silenced by the thick, plush rugs that my mother was currently treating like common carpet. Cassandra was draped over the velvet sofa, her laughter ringing out like cheap wind chimes as she flaunted a brand new Hermes Birkin bag in a shade of sunset orange that screamed for attention. To a woman like Victoria, that bag was a trophy, a signal to the world that they were still part of the 1%, even as their bank accounts bled dry. I watched my sister stroke the leather with a reverence she had never shown a human being, while Sterling looked on with the smug, self-satisfied grin of a man who thought he had bought his way into a dynasty. But as I stepped closer to offer a tray of hors d'oeuvres, my eyes didn't stay on the bag. They drifted to my mother's right hand as she reached for a glass of champagne. The space on her ring finger was hauntingly empty, a pale band of skin where my grandmother's 3-carat Victorian diamond should have been. That ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of our history, a legacy left to me by the only woman in this family who understood that true wealth is measured in character, not in the labels on your luggage. My grandmother had whispered to me on her deathbed that the ring was meant for my future, a safety net for a rainy day. But seeing my mother's bare finger and Cassandra's garish new accessory, the sickening truth settled in my stomach like lead. The disgust I felt wasn't just for the money. It was for the utter lack of respect for the hands that had built our family's foundation. To my mother and sister, that diamond, a symbol of endurance and grace, was nothing more than a liquid asset to be pawned off for a temporary high of social validation. They had traded a piece of our soul for a piece of Italian leather, proving once and for all that they were the ultimate liabilities they always accused me of being. I felt a surge of that silence of the abyss, a cold, calculating clarity that replaced the lingering traces of my old grief. I realized then that they didn't just want my house. They wanted to consume everything I had ever loved to fuel their own vanity. I stood there in my white apron, the invisible servant in my own palace, watching them toast to a future built on the bones of my past. Victoria caught my eye for a second, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before it was instantly replaced by her usual mask of haughty indifference. "Don't just stand there gaping at your sister's things, Eleanor," she snapped, her voice low and sharp. "It's pathetic to covet what you'll never have. Go check the roast." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I turned back toward the kitchen, but instead of checking the oven, I reached into the hidden pocket of my apron and pulled out my phone. My thumbs moved across the screen with surgical precision as I typed a message to my lead financial strategist at Pinnacle Group. The plan had been to let them stay through the holiday, to give them one last night of delusional comfort before the reality of their bankruptcy hit them like a freight train. But the sight of that empty finger changed everything. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Mark," I wrote, my heart beating with the steady, cold rhythm of a woman who had finally found her sword. "Proceed with the early debt recovery and the foreclosure filings for the Boston property immediately. I want the final notices delivered to this address tonight. No exceptions." I hit send, watching the little blue bar slide across the screen, the digital sound of a trap snapping shut. As I pocketed the phone, I took a deep breath, the scent of the wood smoke and the expensive candles in the hallway feeling more like mine than ever before. I was no longer just the daughter who had failed to live up to their shallow expectations. I was the architect of their reckoning. I straightened my apron, smoothed my hair, and prepared to walk back into that dining room to play the role of the humble maid for just a few minutes longer. The ASMR for the brain was just beginning, and I wanted to savor every second of their misplaced confidence before the guest of honor, Sterling, realized that the woman he was trying to impress was actually the woman who held his entire career in her hands. The transition from victim to strategist was complete, and as the snow continued to howl against the reinforced glass of my windows, I knew that the storm inside was going to be much, much worse for them than the one outside. I stepped back into the dining room, the weight of the phone in my pocket feeling like a loaded weapon after I had authorized the early debt recovery. Sterling was already leaning back in his chair, a glass of my vintage Bordeaux in his hand, holding court as if he were the king of the mountain, while my family huddled around him with faces glowing in a sickening mix of greed and desperation. He was talking about his visionary leadership and the inevitable promotion he expected, but I could see the telltale signs of a man drowning in his own lies, the subtle tremor in his fingers, and the way his eyes darted to his phone every time it buzzed. He was a mid-level manager at a firm that had just been swallowed whole by my conglomerate, yet here he was, performing a grand play for a family that was too blinded by their own narcissism to see through the cracks. "It is a high-stakes world, Arthur," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a rehearsed baritone that sounded like a bad imitation of a business interview. "But when you are at the top, you learn to spot the sharks before they spot you. Although I have to admit, this new CEO at Pinnacle Group is a ghost whose face no one has seen, yet she has already gutted the board of directors like she is clearing out a pantry." I stood in the shadows, letting the silence of the abyss wrap around me like a protective shroud as I watched this man brag about his proximity to power while being completely oblivious to the fact that the ghost was currently refilling his water glass. The intellectual satisfaction was intoxicating. It was as if I were watching a fly boast about its strength while trapped in a web I had spent 3 years weaving. Victoria was nodding along, her eyes shining with the reflected light of the crystal chandelier, as she already spent the money she thought Sterling would bring into the family. "I have always said that success recognizes success, Sterling," she purred, her voice dripping with a patronizing warmth that she had never once offered me. "My daughter Cassandra has such an eye for winners, and it is a shame Eleanor could not follow that example. But then again, some people are born to lead, and others are born to serve." She gestured vaguely toward me without even looking, her dismissiveness so total that it was almost comical. I moved forward with fluid, professional movements, the invisible observer preparing to reveal the first crack in their reality. I leaned in to pour a fresh glass of wine for Sterling, the rich, red liquid swirling against the glass like a warning. As the light from the fireplace caught the edge of my profile, Sterling paused mid-sentence, his rehearsed charm faltering for a split second. He looked at me, not as a piece of furniture, but as a person, and I felt the shift in the room's energy as the first seed of doubt was planted. I did not say a word. I simply kept my eyes cast down, the perfect image of a humble servant, but I ensured that my posture held a subtle, unyielding strength that did not match the apron I was wearing. I could feel his gaze burning into the side of my face as his mind likely raced through the thousands of faces he had seen in corporate directories and high-level meetings. The tension was a physical thing now, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. Sterling's face, which had been a confident, blotchy red from the wine, began to pale until it was the color of the Aspen snow outside. He started to stammer, his leader of men persona crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. "Is everything all right, Sterling?" Cassandra asked, her voice laced with a sudden sharp anxiety as she felt her golden ticket beginning to waver. Sterling did not answer her. He was too busy staring at the woman he had only known through sternly worded memos and high-level directives. The silence in the room became deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of my mother's lungs as she realized her failed daughter was the center of the attention of the only man who mattered to her. I caught his eye for just one heartbeat, a cold, professional acknowledgement that told him exactly who was in charge, before I turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving the echo of his fear to linger at the table like an unwanted guest. Sterling's hand shook so violently that the silver fork in his other hand clattered against the fine china, a sharp, metallic sound that felt like a gunshot in the heavy silence of the room. I stood over him, the neck of the vintage wine bottle hovering inches from his glass, my face a mask of professional neutrality, while my internal monologue was a symphony of cold amusement. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and dilated with the kind of primal fear usually reserved for someone staring down a predator in the wild. I could see the exact moment the gears turned in his head. The moment he realized that the ghost CEO, who had dismantled his board of directors just that morning, was currently standing at his elbow in a plain white linen apron. "Miss Eleanor," he managed to choke out, his voice cracking like a dry branch under the weight of a heavy winter snow. The air in the room seemed to vanish as he struggled to find the breath to address me properly, his face turning a sickly shade of gray that matched the overcast Aspen sky outside. Victoria, however, was far too intoxicated by the sound of her own voice and the smell of a wealth she did not actually possess to notice the sudden collapse of her guest of honor. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh that set my teeth on edge, leaning forward with a patronizing smirk directed straight at me. "Oh, Sterling, please do not let the help distract you from your story," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that she considered a sign of high breeding. She waved a dismissive hand toward me as if I were nothing more than a smudge on the expensive wallpaper. "This is just my eldest daughter, Eleanor. I suppose it is a bit of a shock to see her in such a functional capacity, but she has always been something of a disappointment to the family. She is a failed mother with a failed career, and she is currently scrubbing our floors just to scrape together enough money to pay off the massive debts her poor life choices have accrued." She turned back to Sterling, her expression shifting instantly to one of predatory charm. "She is lucky we even let her stay in the mudroom. Most people would have left her to the wolves years ago." Sterling's mouth hung open, his gaze darting between my mother's smug face and my own calm, steady eyes. He looked as though he were watching a woman walk off a cliff while whistling a cheerful tune. He tried to speak again, his lips moving but no sound coming out, as the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of my mother's lies hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch, the scent of his panicked sweat cutting through the expensive aroma of the roast beef, and I caught his eye with a gaze that was as sharp and cold as a surgical scalpel. It was a silent warning, a nonverbal directive that told him his entire professional existence depended on what he did in the next 10 seconds. I wanted him to feel the same hollow, gut-punching terror that his subordinates felt when he played his corporate power games. Only this time, he was the one without a safety net. The irony of the situation was a masterpiece of poetic justice. My mother was digging her own grave with a silver spoon, and she was inviting the man who was about to lose everything to help her shovel the dirt. The room was a study in contrasts, the warm, crackling fire in the hearth versus the icy dread radiating from Sterling. My mother's delusional pride versus the cold, hard reality of my ownership. Despite the temperature outside being well below zero, Sterling was beginning to sweat, thick beads of it rolling down his forehead and disappearing into the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. He looked like a man having a heart attack in slow motion, his confidence entirely evaporated. Cassandra, ever the oblivious social climber, noticed his distress but interpreted it through her own shallow lens. "Is it too warm in here, darling?" she asked, her voice an artificial coo that probably made him want to scream. "Eleanor, do not just stand there like a statue. Open a window or something. You are clearly making Sterling uncomfortable with your presence." I simply bowed my head, the perfect image of a submissive maid, and felt the power of my secret like a warm ember in my chest. "Go on, Sterling," Victoria urged, her eyes fixed on his with a disturbing intensity. "You were telling us about the board meeting?" It must be so exhilarating to be in the room when the big decisions are made. Sterling let out a sound that was half sob, half chuckle, the delirious noise of a man who had finally realized the magnitude of the disaster he was sitting in. He took a massive gulp of the wine I had just poured, nearly choking as he tried to swallow his fear along with the expensive vintage. I stepped back into the shadows of the dining room, my work for the moment finished, and watched the light of the chandelier dance off the empty space on my mother's finger. They were so sure of their victory, so certain that they had finally found a way back into the light of the American dream, that they could not see the shadow I was casting over their entire world. The show was moving into its most dangerous act, and as I watched the sweat continue to soak through Sterling's collar, I knew that the final reckoning was only a few minutes away. The silence following Sterling's near collapse was broken not by a confession, but by the rhythmic, muffled thuds of small feet running across the reclaimed oak floorboards upstairs. It was Oliver and Sophie, my two heartbeats, likely playing a game of tag in the hallway of the wing I had told them to stay in. To anyone else, it was the sound of childhood innocence, but in this room, it was a transgression against the fragile image of perfection my mother was trying to sell. Cassandra froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, her face contorting into a look of sheer, unadulterated annoyance that she usually reserved for a delayed flight or a chipped manicure. Mother, do you hear that?" she whined, her voice cutting through the tension like a dull saw. "The thumping is giving me a migraine. How are we supposed to have a sophisticated evening with Sterling when it sounds like a herd of elephants is stampeding overhead?" She glanced at Sterling, trying to draw him into her pettiness, but he remained frozen, his eyes fixed on his plate as if it held the secrets to his survival. Victoria's eyes snapped toward me, her nostrils flaring with a cold, aristocratic rage that made her look older than her years. The silence of the abyss in my chest deepened as I watched her, the woman who had once been my world, now appearing as nothing more than a hollow, toxic stranger. "Eleanor, I told you to keep those children silent," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous vibration. "They are a distraction. Sterling is a guest of the highest caliber, and I will not have his evening ruined by your inability to control your baggage." The word baggage hit me with the force of a physical blow, yet I did not flinch. To her, My children, her own grandchildren, were not human beings with souls and needs. They were liabilities that lowered the property value of her social standing. She did not care that they were in their own home, in their own beds, or that the very floors they were running on were paid for by the mother she was currently humiliating. The cruelty shifted from irritation to something much darker, something that triggered the fierce, protective instinct of every mother who has ever had to choose between her pride and her children. Victoria leaned in, her voice dropping to a command that was as chilling as the blizzard outside. "Take them downstairs, Eleanor. Now," she ordered. "If they cannot be quiet, lock them in the wine cellar. Or better yet, take them out to the heated equipment shed by the garage. I do not care if they are cold. I just do not want to hear them. Sterling is here to see a family of status, not a daycare for the struggling." My heart thudded in my chest, not with the frantic beat of the scared girl I used to be, but with the heavy, rhythmic drum of a woman who had finally found the limit of her patience. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw the absolute moral bankruptcy that no amount of Aspen real estate could ever cover. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not point out that the wine cellar she wanted to lock them in was stocked with $500 bottles of Petrus that I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. Instead, I simply gave a small, subservient nod, my eyes remaining fixed on the floorboards I had just scrubbed. "I will take care of it, Mother," I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I turned and walked toward the grand staircase, leaving the dining room behind. As I climbed the stairs, the sound of their laughter, forced, hollow, and desperate, floated up after me. They were down there playing at being kings and queens, while I was ascending to the only throne that truly mattered, the role of a mother who protects her own. When I reached the upper landing, I found Oliver and Sophie standing by the railing, their eyes wide and reflecting the amber glow of the hallway sconces. They were only 6 and 4, yet they were old enough to sense the poison in the air below. They did not ask why their grandmother was being mean. They only looked at me for the safety they knew I would provide. I knelt on the plush carpet and pulled them both into my arms, the scent of their hair, a mix of baby shampoo and the mountain air, grounding me in a way the boardroom never could. "Is the mean lady going to make us leave, Mommy?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I squeezed them tighter, a fierce, silent vow forming in my mind. "No, my loves," I whispered back, my voice steady and filled with a terrifyingly calm resolve. "The mean people are the ones who are leaving. It is almost over, I promise. We are just going to stay up here and wait for the snow to finish its work." I stayed there for a long moment, listening to the wind howl against the glass, knowing that in less than an hour, the family that had tried to cast my children into the cold would find themselves exactly where they deserved to be. I descended the grand staircase with a heavy, measured grace, the silence of the abyss now firmly anchored in my soul. Below me, the dining room was a theater of the absurd, where my mother was busy weaving a tapestry of lies about our supposed noble lineage and the sacrifices she had made to maintain our family's high standing. I watched from the shadows of the hallway for a moment as she gestured with an empty glass, her voice a theatrical trill that filled the room with the stench of desperation. She was telling Sterling about the heirlooms that had been passed down through generations, all while her own finger remained tellingly bare. The hypocrisy was a physical weight, but I did not let it crush me. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my white apron and felt the small, velvet-lined box, the weight of a legacy they had tried to pawn for a moment of vanity. I stepped into the light of the dining room, moving with the invisible observer precision I had perfected throughout the evening. The conversation faltered as I approached the table, not because they respected me, but because I was an interruption to their performance. Victoria's face twisted into a familiar expression of sharp annoyance. "I thought I told you to stay with the children in the cellar, Eleanor," she hissed, her voice a low vibration intended to keep her noble image intact before Sterling. "We are discussing matters of heritage that are clearly beyond your understanding." I didn't flinch. I simply walked to the head of the table and placed the small midnight blue box directly in front of her, right next to her half-empty wine glass. The click of the box hitting the wood was soft, yet in the sudden silence of the room, it sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Victoria stared at the box, her breath hitching in her throat. With a trembling hand, she flipped the lid open. There it was, my grandmother's 3-carat Victorian diamond, sparkling with a cold, ancient fire under the light of the chandelier. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollowed out and gray. "I found this in a dusty corner of a pawn shop on 4th Street, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that forced everyone at the table to listen. "The owner told me a woman came in 2 weeks ago, looking quite frantic. She sold this piece of our history, a ring that survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, for exactly $2,000. I looked over at Cassandra, whose orange Birkin bag sat on the sideboard like a neon sign of her greed. $2,000, I repeated, my gaze shifting back to my mother. Exactly the price of that sunset-colored leather bag my sister is so proud of. The show, don't tell reality of the situation hit the room like a physical blow. I didn't need to call her a liar. The diamond was doing it for me. To this group, legacy was just a word used to impress neighbors. But to the woman who actually built this house, it was a sacred trust. I redeemed it, I continued, using the word for reclaiming a soul as much as a piece of jewelry. Because, unlike some people in this room, I understand that a legacy is something you protect, not something you trade for a temporary high of social validation. I saw the flicker of disappointment in her children in the way Victoria's eyes darted away, a silent admission that she had failed the very values she pretended to uphold. She had treated the American dream as a lottery ticket rather than a result of hard work and integrity. The silence was broken by Arthur, who slammed his hand against the table so hard the silverware rattled. His face was a dark, mottled red, his eyes bulging with a mix of shame and defensive fury. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the room I paid for. "How dare you bring your petty grievances to this table and embarrass your mother in front of our guest? You are a failure, Eleanor, a struggling maid who has forgotten her place." He stood up, towering over me in a desperate attempt to reclaim the power he had already lost. "You will take that box, you will take those children, and you will leave this house immediately. We do not need the struggling energy of a woman who doesn't know how to respect her betters. I looked up at him, my expression unreadable, my silence of the abyss now a cold, hard shield. The irony was delicious. He was trying to kick me out of my own sanctuary, while Sterling sat 3 feet away, looking like he wanted to crawl under the rug and disappear. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was already here. I can't believe a mother would sell a family heirloom for a handbag. Has anyone here ever dealt with a family member who valued status over blood? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you're rooting for Eleanor. Arthur's roar was still vibrating through the crystal chandeliers when I felt a firm, cool hand grip my elbow. It wasn't the frantic, sweaty grasp of my mother or the clumsy shove of my father. It was a touch of professional composure. I turned to see Isabel, Julian's girlfriend, her eyes sharp and analytical behind her designer frames. She didn't look at me with the pity my mother used or the disdain my sister favored. She looked at me with the calculated respect one professional gives another. "A word in the kitchen, Eleanor," she said, her voice a calm, low frequency that cut through the cacophony of my father's ego. I followed her, my white apron rustling against the silk of my hidden dress, the transition from the dining room theater to the cold, sterile logic of the kitchen feeling like a homecoming. Once the swinging doors closed behind us, the noise of the family's delusional grandiosity faded into a dull hum. Isabel didn't waste time with pleasantries or false apologies for my family's behavior. She was a lawyer, and she spoke in the diction of expertise that I had come to live by. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a slim manila folder, her movements precise and certain. "I've been watching this family for 6 months, Ms. Eleanor," she began, the use of my formal title sending a jolt of recognition through the air. "I am a lawyer first and a girlfriend second. I cannot, in good conscience, witness the level of rot I've seen tonight without acting." She slid the folder across the marble island, the same island I had just scrubbed, to reveal a set of documents Julian had been hiding. I scanned the pages, my eyes instantly zeroing in on the legal jargon. It was a transfer of title for the family's estate in Boston. Julian had drafted a predatory agreement, intending to trick Victoria and Arthur into signing over their only remaining asset to him under the guise of protection from creditors. He was planning to leave our parents with nothing, not out of a sense of justice, but out of the same selfish greed that Victoria had used to sell my grandmother's ring. "He thinks they're too distracted by Sterling to read the fine print," Isabel whispered, her eyes meeting mine with a spark of shared understanding. "But I know who you really are. I've followed the Pinnacle Group's acquisitions. I know you're the one who turned a failing tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire." The relief that washed over me was unexpected, a rare moment of finding an ally in a house full of enemies. I realized that while I had been observing them from the shadows, Isabel had been observing them from within their inner circle, gathering the receipts I needed to finalize their eviction. We spent the next few minutes in a hushed, rapid-fire consultation, merging our legal documents like two generals preparing for a final assault. I showed her the digital notices of the debt recovery I had authorized earlier, and she showed me the proof of Julian's attempted fraud. It was a perfect, cold alignment of justice. We weren't doing this out of spite. We were doing it because the American dream is built on the backs of those who work, not those who scheme to steal the labor of others. "We have everything we need," I said, my voice as steady as the mountain outside. Isabel nodded, tucking the folder back into her bag with a look of grim satisfaction. We were about to step back into the lion's den when the kitchen doors swung open with a violent thud. Julian stood there, his face flushed with wine and the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. He looked at me, then at Isabel, his lip curling into a sneer that mirrored our mother's. "What are you doing in here with the help, Isabel?" he barked, his voice dripping with a casual, inherited cruelty. He stepped toward me, his presence an invasion of the space I had worked so hard to claim. "Get back to the dining room, Eleanor," he ordered, waving a dismissive hand toward the door. "Go back to your place and finish your job as the maid. The adults are talking, and your struggling energy is starting to ruin my evening, too." I didn't blink. I didn't even breathe. I simply looked at him and felt a surge of absolute, terrifying calm. The trap was set. The receipts were in hand. And the man standing before me was about to find out exactly how much his maid was worth. Julian shoved me back into the dining room with a chuckle that echoed the hollow arrogance of a man who believed his own lies. I took my place near the sideboard, the perfect image of a submissive daughter, while Victoria leaned across the table toward Sterling, her eyes glittering with a predatory sort of hope. "Sterling, dear," she began, her voice a sugary poison that made my skin crawl. "Since you are such a man of immense influence at your firm, perhaps you could find a small corner for Eleanor? A janitorial position, perhaps? She is quite accustomed to manual labor now, and it would be a mercy to give her a steady paycheck to cover those mounting debts we discussed." She laughed, a brittle, high-pitched sound, and Cassandra joined in, her gaze fixed on her new orange bag as if it were a shield against the reality of our family's decay. The air in the room seemed to freeze as Sterling's fork clattered onto his plate with a sharp, final ring. He stood up so abruptly that his wineglass nearly toppled, his face a ghastly, translucent white that made him look 20 years older. "Victoria, stop it!" he choked out, his voice cracking with a terror so profound it silenced even my mother's rehearsed chatter. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, before turning back to the family with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. "I cannot give her a job," he stammered, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Because this is Ms. Eleanor. She is the CEO of Pinnacle Group. She didn't just buy my company this morning. She bought the entire parent corporation, every asset, every contract, and every career, including mine." I did not wait for their reaction. I reached behind my waist and slowly untied the strings of the plain linen apron, letting the fabric fall to the marble floor in a crumpled heap. Beneath it, the midnight silk of my tailored dress shimmered under the light of the $8 million chandelier, a physical manifestation of the power I had spent 3 years building in the dark. I didn't need to scream. The silence of the abyss had finally reached the surface, and its weight was crushing. Cassandra's hand trembled so violently that her crystal glass slipped, the deep red Bordeaux splashing across the white Persian rug like an open wound, but no one moved to clean it. My mother's mouth hung open, her face a mask of frozen horror as she realized the struggling failure she had been mocking was the very woman who held the keys to her survival. I stood at the head of the table, the owner of the house and the master of their fates, and let the silence tell them exactly what their arrogance had cost them. The silence in the dining room was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of a theater before a performance. It was the suffocating, airless vacuum of a tomb. Victoria's face, which had been so full of rehearsed aristocratic poise, began to twitch as the reality of Sterling's words sank into her skin like acid. The nauseating shift in her demeanor was instantaneous. She let out a shaky, fluttery laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "Well, Eleanor, my goodness, why didn't you just say so?" she chirped, her voice rising an octave in a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim her role as the proud mother of a success story. She stood up, her hands reaching out as if to embrace the daughter she had just called a liability and a disappointment. "Arthur, did you hear that? Our Eleanor, the CEO! I always knew that beneath that quiet exterior, there was a titan of industry waiting to be born. It's the family blood, of course. We've always been a lineage of leaders." I did not move. I did not soften. I stood at the head of my table, watching her with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying culture under a microscope. The silence of the abyss was my greatest weapon now. I let her babble, let her reach out her hand, the one missing the diamond ring she had sold to buy Cassandra's sunset orange vanity. And then I stepped back, just enough to leave her grasping at nothing but the cold mountain air. I reached into the manila folder Isabel had handed me in the kitchen, pulling out a stack of documents that felt as heavy and final as a tombstone. "Enough, Victoria," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through her frantic flattery like a razor through silk. I slid the first document across the marble toward my father, who was still slumped in his chair, looking as though his entire world had been liquidated in a single afternoon. "This is the final foreclosure notice for the estate in Boston," I stated, the words coming out with a cold fairness that left no room for negotiation. "The bank took possession of it 30 days ago due to 24 months of unpaid property taxes and a second mortgage you took out to fund Cassandra's influencer lifestyle. But you already knew that, didn't you, Arthur? That's why you broke into this house. You didn't come for a holiday. You came because you had nowhere else to go." Arthur's blotchy face turned a deep, bruised purple, but he couldn't find the words to argue. I didn't stop. I flipped to the next page, the ink black and unforgiving. "Pinnacle Group, my company, purchased that debt 3 weeks ago. I now own the Boston house, every stick of furniture inside it, and every debt you've accrued trying to maintain the illusion of the American dream while you were actually living a nightmare of your own making." The intellectual satisfaction of this moment was profound, a clinical ASMR for the brain, as I laid out the financial trap they had built for themselves. They had spent their lives measuring people by their assets, and now they were discovering that they were the ones with a net worth of 0. I turned my gaze to Cassandra, who was clutching her orange bag as if it could somehow protect her from the truth. "And as for this $8 million retreat," I continued, my voice gaining a sharp, legal edge, "you didn't stumble into a lucky rental. You used an old security code from a business partner you cheated 5 years ago to gain entry to a private estate owned by a holding company you couldn't even name. That holding company is a subsidiary of Pinnacle." I leaned in, my shadow falling over the table, over the wine-stained rug, and over the family that had tried to lock my children in a cellar. "You are not guests. You are not the masters of this house. You are illegal residents, trespassers in a home paid for by the struggling mother energy you so despise." The satisfaction I felt wasn't the hot, messy joy of revenge. It was the cool, clean relief of justice being served. I was no longer the daughter who needed their validation. I was the woman who had protected her children and her grandmother's legacy from their parasitic greed. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was precisely 9:45 in the evening. I raised my hand and signaled to the two men who had been standing silently by the kitchen door, the real security team for the estate, not the servants my mother had imagined them to be. "The blizzard is worsening, Eleanor," Julian cried out, finally finding his voice as he saw the security guard step forward. "You can't throw your own parents out into a storm. It's Christmas. Have you no heart?" I looked at him. The brother who had tried to trick our parents out of their last asset. And I felt nothing but a profound, final indifference. "I learned about heart from you, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the frost on the windows. "I learned it on the night Sophie had a fever of 104 degrees, and my own mother told me that a sick child was a liability that would ruin her party." I turned back to Victoria, who was now weeping, not with regret, but with the frustration of a cornered predator. "You wanted the struggling mother energy out of your sight, Mother," I whispered, leaning in close so only she could hear the finality in my words. "I'm simply granting your wish. You have 10 minutes to take your mismatched luggage and your stolen orange bag and leave my property. The police are already on their way to escort you if you refuse." I stood up straight, smoothing my silk dress, the transition from maid to monarch complete. "Since you love the high-stakes world so much, Sterling," I added, glancing at the trembling man, "consider this your first lesson in new management. I don't keep people on the payroll who can't tell the difference between a master and a maid." I walked away from the table without looking back, the sound of my heels on the oak floor the only music I needed. The silence that followed the final, heavy thud of the front door was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 34 years. It wasn't the empty silence of loneliness, but the clean, restorative quiet of a home that had finally been purged of its toxins. Outside, the Aspen blizzard continued to howl against the reinforced glass, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar wood and the faint, sweet scent of the hot cocoa Isabel was stirring in the kitchen. I stood in the center of the living room, no longer the invisible maid or the embattled daughter, but a woman who had finally reclaimed her territory and her peace. The silence of the abyss had transformed into a profound sense of self-possession. I looked at the marble floor, now free of the red wine stain and the discarded linen apron, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. This $8 million sanctuary was no longer a fortress to hide in. It was a foundation upon which I would build a life defined by truth rather than performance. Isabel walked back into the room, handing me a steaming mug before sitting on the rug by the hearth. She didn't ask about the family I had just sent into the night. She knew, as a woman of law and logic, that consequences are simply the natural conclusion of a life built on deceit. Moments later, the soft patter of feet returned, and Oliver and Sophie emerged from the top of the stairs, their eyes searching mine for the storm they had sensed earlier. I opened my arms and they tumbled into them, their small bodies warm and solid against mine. As I held them, I looked down at my hand and watched the light of the fire dance within the depths of my grandmother's Victorian diamond. It was back where it belonged, on the hand of a woman who understood that a legacy isn't something you sell, but something you earn through the quiet, fierce work of survival. This was the rebirth I had been working toward since that dark night 3 years ago when I sat alone with the child burning at 104 degrees. I no longer felt the need to mention my mother's name or dwell on my brother's betrayals. They were ghosts of a past that no longer held power over my self. I felt a deep, therapeutic sense of intellectual satisfaction, knowing that my children would grow up in a world where the American dream meant hard work and integrity, not the hollow pursuit of status. The humanizing reality of the moment was simple. I was tired. I was relieved. And for the first time in my adult life, I was genuinely safe. I didn't hate them. I simply pitied them for being unable to see the warmth of the fire because they were too busy counting the logs. Sophie leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice small and curious as she watched the embers pop in the fireplace. "Mommy, since the mean people are gone, will we always be happy now?" she asked, her innocence a sharp contrast to the battle I had just finished. I pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head, and felt the steady, calm beat of my own heart. I didn't give her a fairy tale answer, because I wanted her to know the strength of the woman who raised her. "We will have our challenges, my love," I whispered into the quiet of my home. "But from now on, we will always be free." As Eleanor sat by the fire holding her children, I felt a weight lift off my own shoulders. There is something so incredibly healing about seeing a woman find the strength to set boundaries. She didn't seek to destroy them. She simply stopped saving them from themselves. My dear listeners, never apologize for the success you built with your own hands. Your value is not determined by those who failed to love you. Remember, integrity and hard work are the only things that truly last when the storm hits. What did you think of Eleanor's choice? Was it justice, or was it too hard to leave them in the snow? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story reminded you of your own strength, please share it with a friend. I'm Lucy May, and I'll see you in the next story.